Alright, welcome back to the Homestyle Gourmet Butchers YouTube channel. So my name's Jared and I'm just going to run you through on how to cut some chump chops. So first off, what I like to do is just take off this little point of fat here. So I'll just mark down until I hit the seam and then push the fat off the top. I find that way when you do cut a chop, the tail of it doesn't have that fat around the outside and it just looks a lot more presentable. Then I'll flip my chump upside down and I'll just continue to trim it up underneath. So I'll want to just sort of denude this eye fillet that sits on the bottom of the chump and then scoop out any extra fat that is sitting on the bottom. You'll find that where I just cut there is a little seam of fat, so you want to make sure you remove that. Then I'll proceed to just take face cuts off both ends of the actual chump itself. That way, when I do slice out my chumps, if I go 3 or 4 chops, they're going to be all the same thickness and they're going to be nice and square. I find it's really important to trim up the underneath of the chump before you slice them out, as if you do it afterwards it's a lot more fiddly once you've run them through the bandsaw and cut them into their chops. So doing them beforehand will save you a bit of time at the end, and you can make sure that you take off the bulk bits of fat all in one hit. Now when it comes to actually cutting your chops, you've got a few different options on how thick you want to cut them, and that will all depend on how big the chump is. But a lot of the time you'll cut 3 or 4 chops. Sometimes you will have to cut more if a customer requests them a lot thinner, or a few less if they want them a lot thicker. But on average we find that we either get 3 or 4 chops and they generally come out really nice. I'll just give you a better angle here so you can see more closely on where I'm cutting and what I'm cutting off. So what I'm going to do here is just cut down through the fat until I hit the seam. So the seam is the actual joining tissue between that muscle and that top layer of fat. So you only want to cut in deep enough till you hit the seam, and then you can push that fat off. Now as for these face cuts, my first face cut was to square up the chop. My second face cut was to clean up the very end of the chop. So the second face cut is taking off the majority of the bone. The chump does have a bone that gets bigger as it goes along, so it's at its biggest point where my face cut was. So you can see there I'm just sort of pushing that fat away just to get rid of the extra fat, just neaten up the chop once it is cut, and then I'll just pop my knife underneath that silver and just denude to the very top of that eye fillet. Now when it comes to actually cutting your chops, I'm cutting these into 3 as the size dictates how many chops I'm going to cut. So you can choose whether you're going to cut 3 or 4, it'll just obviously mean you're going to have a thinner chop. If you had bigger chumps off bigger lambs, you could cut the 4. It just depends on how thick you want your chop or what the window or the shop requires. Okay, so now comes cutting the chops itself. So safety wise here, you need to sort of push your chops through by pulling the meat aside. So you want to be pulling those chops apart where you've marked, that way you don't have any loose bits of meat that can catch and grab and pull your fingers into the saw. Now this also applies for mesh gloves and long sleeves. If you do have a mesh glove, always take it off before you use a bandsaw, and if you do have long sleeves, make sure you either remove your jumper or pull them up around your elbows. You can see that as I'm pushing them through the saw, I'm also pulling the meat apart. That way if it was to slip or my hand was to slip, my hands aren't going to be going into the blade, they're going to be going away from the blade. This also applies to dangly bracelets, watches, loose sleeves, and definitely mesh gloves. Anything that's loose and could catch and pull your hand in is a big no-no. So I always tell the apprentices too, if a chop does catch, just let it go and let it get sucked in. You'd much rather scrap a chop than actually lose a finger. So now that we're up to trimming and displaying our chop, I'll just explain how a chop has a good face and a bad face. So the way you'll split your chops here, so I've cut 3, which means I'll have 2 fall one way and 1 the other. So the way it'll work is the biggest end will fall to the end that I took the face cut, and then the 2 smaller ones will fall to the direction of the smaller face cut. If you have cut 4 chops, you will find that you may get it so it's an even split, 2 and 2, but majority of the time it will be 3 and 1 then. The reason we do this is if it does have a smaller or a bigger bone, you want the smaller bone facing up and not down. And when it comes to actually trimming the fat, you're just wanting to neaten it up, and if there's any sort of larger fat clumps like just there, you'll just trim it off and make it so it's a nice even flow of fat. So after you've trimmed that off there, you'll also find there's a little bit of a nook of fat there, right where I'm about to cut it, which is from your opposite end to where you've cut your triangle. So if there is a large clump of fat there, I like to nook it out. You don't have to, some people do like the fat left in because they like the taste. That'll just be a personal preference or depending on what shop you're in. In our shop we do take it out, so I just come in underneath that fat there and just roll the fat out. You can see as I've been trimming these and I put them to their good and their bad face, you'll have chops that will sort of fall and want to face to the left and some that want to face to the right. So this will help when I actually go to display them on the tray. I'll have all of the left down one side and then all of the right down the other. It'll make it look a whole lot neater on the tray and the display of it will be a lot more appealing to the eye. You can see here as I use chops to fill the left, they're all the same and look uniform, and then once I've done layering down along there, I can put some down the right and then double layer it or tier it down the other side. Thanks for watching. Hopefully if you're an apprentice you can sort of take something away from this. If not and you're just a customer, at least you know where the chops come from and what's involved in actually getting the chops ready for display. Thanks again. Don't forget to hit that subscribe and that bell.